Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Geneviève Zubrzicki. I'm director of the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies at the University of Michigan. And today I have the great pleasure to host Patrice Dąbrowski, who will be talking to us about her recent book, hot from the press, The Carpathians, Discovering the Highlands of Poland and Ukraine. Before I introduce our guest, I want to to give you a few announcements about forthcoming events, some of them coming very soon. So I want to advertise the Edge Fest. You have Steve Swell's If Trains Could Speak, a jazz concert on October 30th that we're co-sponsoring. We also have the Ann Arbor Polish Film Festival from November 5th to November 7th. You can check the program on the Michigan Theater website. We're a proud sponsor now for several years of that important film festival. And then on November 17th, we organize an important roundtable also titled Is Polexit on the Horizon? Poland's Domestic Politics, Law, and the EU. It's a roundtable on the recent, the October 7th ruling of Poland's Constitutional Tribunal. That is not recognizing the primacy of EU law over Polish law. And we will have three speakers on the issues. We'll have Sławek Sierakowski, who's a political analyst, sociologist, and a co-founder of Krytyka Polityczna. Marcin Menkes, who's associate professor at the Warsaw School of Economics and a visiting professor at the law school at the University of Michigan. And Jarosław Szczepański, assistant professor of political science and international relations at the University of Warsaw, and currently a Fulbright fellow at Ohio State University. But today we're discussing, if this is the second event this semester we have in our book club series, we invite the authors of recent books of importance. And today we have Patrice Dąbrowski with us to discuss her most recent book that I think was officially published this week. Patrice Dąbrowski is an associate at Harvard's Ukrainian Research Institute. She has taught and worked at Harvard, Brown, the University of Massachusetts at Amherst, and at the University of Vienna. She's currently also a member of the board of directors of the Polish Institute of Arts and Science of America, known as PIASA, and the editor of H. Poland, which we all know, and we're very grateful for your work there, Patrice. Patrice is the author of three books. The first, Poland, the First 1,000 Years, published in 2014. The second, actually, I'm going out of order. The first one was Commemorations in the Shaping of Modern Poland, 2004. The second was The First 1,000 Years in 2014. And then just a few weeks ago, The Carpathians, Discovering the Highlands of Poland and Ukraine. So I'm showing the book here, and you will have in the chat section also, you will have a link to the book's publisher, as well as a discount code so that you can get a discount offered by Cornell University Press. I want to remind people that the format, Dr. Dąbrowski will be speaking for about 20-25 minutes about the book, the key issues. I will have a few questions for her, and then we open to a Q&A session. You can write your questions as we go. You don't need to wait to the Q&A session. And then I will pose those questions to Patrice Dąbrowski, who will answer them. I want to thank everyone, the team, for putting this together, and thank also and welcome everyone for being online on Zoom for this event. So welcome to Patrice Dąbrowski. We're super happy to have you with us from the East Coast. I know it's been very windy and we have contingency plans in case power goes out where you are, but it should be fine. So welcome.
Thank you, Geneviève, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to present my book to the Copernicus Center for Polish Studies. I only wish that times were such that I could be there in person, although Zoom, of course, has its advantages as well. I'm furthermore happy to be able to present my book to a group of people who already may know something about one of the mountain ranges that I deal with in my book, the Tatra Mountains, because of the series of lectures and I believe even an exhibition that you had at the University of Michigan.
Just before the pandemic, we did indeed have an exhibit on Zakopane, which we put together with Maciej Krupa,
Yes,
whom you know,
indeed.
and of course, a historian of the Tatra Mountains, and with Muzeum Tatrzańskie. So we work with them.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Well, those are great people to work with.
Absolutely.
Now, let me go ahead and share my screen, go through the usual routine. All right, great. So my own encounter with the Carpathians goes way, way back. I first came to know and love Poland's mountains when on the Kościuszko Foundation junior year abroad, back in the days of state socialism. So you even see the black and white photo from Polish Times. During that time, I participated in various rajdy or group mountain excursions, even meeting my husband on one of them. And this book is dedicated to him. Yet mountain climbing, which I've done on many an occasion since, in and of itself was not enough to motivate me to write a book about the Carpathians. Intellectually, I took a rather circuitous route to the subject. After finishing my first book, Commemorations in the Shaping of Modern Poland, I wanted to know more about how seemingly isolated 19th century peasants like the Tatra Mountain Highlanders, the so-called Górale, became Polish. As you may know it, most peasants at that time were far from identifying themselves in those terms, that is, as Polish. I soon became fascinated by the assertion that the Tatra Mountains were discovered by the Warsaw physician Tytus Chałubiński in 1873. So I looked at that encounter with and in the mountains. I also took an interest in the Tatra Society, the first Polish alpine club established that same year. While in Poland, I set to reading its yearbook, the Pamiętnik Towarzystwa Tatrzańskiego. Now, those were the days before such things were available on the internet. Much to my surprise, in the very first issue of the yearbook, let's see if I can get that here for you, from 1876, I found articles about not only the mountains and the Górale of the Tatra Mountains, but also about a people called the Hutsuls. Now, who in the world were the Hutsuls, I wondered, and what were they doing in the Tatra Society yearbook? From the article by Father Sofron Witwicki, and little did I know then that the Greek Catholic priest would become one of my protagonists, I learned that the Hutsuls were the indigenous Highlanders of the Eastern Carpathians, which at that time comprised the southeastern corner of the Austrian crown land of Galicia. Today, this is part of Ukraine. Were they too being discovered? And if so, by whom and how? In order better to pursue this, I studied Ukrainian, then headed off to Western Ukraine, first on a summer fellowship, then on a Fulbright. In the state archive in Ivano-Frankivsk, which is once known as Stanisławów, I found a treasure trove of materials on an alpine club of the interwar period, the Society of Friends of the Hutsul region, or Towarzystwo Przyjaciół Huculszczyzny. Those, interestingly, pointed me back to Warsaw, rather improbably to the Central Military Archive. Now, not an archive one might expect to be of use in a study of tourism in the Carpathians, but indeed it was. So the project was becoming larger, temporally as well as geographically. Ultimately, I would add yet another discovery, that of the Bistada Mountains under state socialism. Now, to shorten what is already a long enough story and big enough project, since the early years of this century, I've been consulting holdings and gathering material in the archives, libraries, and museums of Poland, Ukraine, Austria, well, the United States too, of course, even Australia. Another story I could tell if anyone were interested. The resultant book, The Carpathians, Discovering the Highlands of Poland and Ukraine, presents to an English-speaking audience a look at 3 mountain ranges within the vast Carpathian mountain system and how they were discovered for a broader regional audience. I have aimed the book at a broader public that might take an interest in Polish and Ukrainian past, as well as my scholarly colleagues. At only 200 pages, The Carpathians is less than twice the size of my Poland the First 1,000 Years, which I wrote in the interim. This book is written pithily, in lively and I hope engaging prose, without academic jargon. The Carpathians is full of telling details that flesh out the encounter of lowland visitors, by which I mean tourists, with the highlands and their indigenous Highlanders, in the process turning terra incognita into tourist destinations and iconic national landscapes. Now, the present audience doubtless knows more about the various ranges of the Carpathians than the average English speaker, for whom the Carpathians even today are a terra incognita, fantasized, if at all, as a remote, exotic, wild, forbidding, even threatening space. Still, let's demystify the physical space that is the Carpathian mountain system. Essentially, the Carpathians are the continuation of the Alps of Western and Central Europe. Stretching some 800 miles, the Carpathians extend from near Vienna through the Czech and Slovak lands, arcing along the Polish southern border and into Western Ukraine, and further southward on to Romania and Serbia. The mountains comprise the watershed for the Baltic and Black Seas. They bisect the region that previously was known as Eastern Europe and are that region's most prominent physical feature, no pun intended. Yet at the same time, paradoxically, they are politically peripheral, lying on the outskirts of most of the countries of the region. The various ranges of the Carpathian mountain system that I treat in this book, the Tatra Mountains, the Eastern Carpathians, and the Bistada Mountains, each have a different feel to them. The Tatra Mountains, the preeminent formation of the Western Carpathians, jut upwards like a miniature Alps, with over 60 peaks over 8,000 feet above sea level. The highest of the Polish Tatra Mountains, the Rysy, which you see on the slide there, measures 8,200 feet above sea level. Now, just for comparison's sake, the highest alpine peak, Mont Blanc, is nearly twice that high. So again, these are miniature Alps. The mountains of the Eastern Carpathians, today a part of Western Ukraine, are on the whole rounder in shape and more distant from even the nearest settlements. The summit of the Hoverla, the highest mountain in Czarnohora, measures over 6,700 feet above sea level. The East Carpathian Mountains, where rhododendrons also grow, were famous for their dense forests, the fast-flowing Prut and Cheremos rivers, as well as high upland pastures known as poloninas. While also boasting beautiful poloninas, the Bistada Mountains of southeastern Poland are again of lesser elevation. Mount Tarnitsa, the highest peak in the Bieszczady, is about 4,500 feet above sea level. Located between the Osława and the San rivers, the Bistada Mountains are situated somewhere in between the Western Carpathians, Tatras, and the Eastern Carpathians, in a region that at times has been called the Central Carpathians. So I cover a sample of mountains, west, east, and center. My book is shaped by several paradoxes. I've already mentioned the paradoxical peripheral nature of the Carpathians, this despite their physical centrality for the region of Central and Eastern Europe. A second, my book does not deal with the southern slopes of the Carpathians, including the perhaps more familiar Transylvanian Carpathians. So no Dracula. Obviously, I've lost a selling point here. Instead, I focus on the northern slopes of the Carpathians, cold, gloomy, windswept, if also majestic and awe-inspiring. The discoverers of these Carpathians were Poles and Ukrainians. But again, paradoxically, not just any Poles and Ukrainians. My discoverers hailed not from the Galician Piedmont or Carpathian foothills, but rather from the flatlands and steppe, which characterized the bulk of any territory we would consider Polish-Ukrainian. So think Warsaw or Kharkiv, which prior to the war were cities within the Russian Empire. Now, for these individuals, the mountains were a revelation. Importantly, they also perceived the mountains as their own native mountains, part of their otherwise flat patrimony. Members of the Polish and Ukrainian nations who came to the region from across the Galician-Russian frontier, that is from these national centers, sought to appropriate the highland periphery for their respective nations, to put the mountains on the mental maps of their contemporaries, even to incorporate highland culture and values into their otherwise quintessentially lowland identities, that is, to Highlanderize their respective nations. All this was part of the discovering impetus, I argue. This leads us to another paradox. How can one speak of discovering mountains that are already to some extent known and even inhabited? For the mountains were discovered during the epoch of territoriality, as historian Charles Mayer has defined it, from about the 1860s or 1870s until the 1970s and 80 or thereabouts. This seems pretty late to be discovering, doesn't it? Clearly, people had been in the mountains much earlier. Yet this was also a period when nations and states paid especial attention to the frontier at the edge. And let us not forget that the highland regions were inhabited, if on the whole lightly. There were indigenous Highlanders in areas that come to play in my book. The Górale of the Tatra Mountains in the Western Carpathians, the Hutzels in a territory often referred to simply as the Hutzel region in the Eastern Carpathians, and the Boykos and Lemkos of what we will call, for the sake of convenience, the Central Carpathians, here more specifically the Bistada Mountains. Now, Highlanders were shepherds, loggers, miners, even brigands. Think of Juraj Janosik in the Tatras or Oleksy Dovbush in the Eastern Carpathians. At any rate, these people and their rich highland cultures were being discovered by Highlanders just as their mountains were. And the discoverers needed to countenance these highland populations in their attempt to integrate the respective remote regions into a larger national narrative. The highland borderland had become a real contact zone with repercussions for all involved. Despite the mountains being to a certain extent known and even inhabited, declarations of discovery, paradoxically, are to be found in each of the three microhistories I present in the book. Indeed, discovery is the red thread that runs through the three parts of the book, each dealing with a different mountain region. These self-conscious declarations enable me to juxtapose in one book three very different periods. And here, let me give you a sense of the contents. Part one deals with the discovery of the Tatra Mountains in the last third of the 19th century, a period when there was no independent Polish state. Again, the date of discovery has traditionally been given as 1873, the first summer spent in the Tatra Mountains by Warsaw physician Tytus Chałobinski with his family. In the words of writer, artist, and Highland activist Stanisław Witkiewicz, Chałobinski discovered the Tatras for us. Now, given that people had been in the mountains prior to that time, with some Krakowians even summering there already, this points to a Warsaw-centric perspective, to the popularizing of the region among visitors from outside Galicia, from the other two partition zones. Chałobinski would discover a peculiarly Polish type of alpinism, one in which lowlanders communed in the mountains with their highland counterparts. Their encounter with the attractive highland population of the Górale inspired members of the Polish intelligentsia to create a new hybrid culture, injecting elements of highland culture into that of the intelligentsia. To give you but one example, Witkiewicz took inspiration from the Highlanders' penchant, there we go, to carve decorations in wood. He saw, or rather imagined, their designs as remnants of a Polish style that had once been common in the lowlands as well, but which had been pushed out by encroaching civilization. On the basis of the Tatra Highlanders' native architecture and handicrafts, Witkiewicz created Zakopane style. Now, as you see from the slide, this more developed form of architecture and applied arts enabled highland culture to permeate the villas of the upper class Poles who came to vacation in Zakopane in droves. By the outbreak of World War I, Zakopane and the Tatras would become a new national center, a summer and then later winter capital of a Poland of the mind. The Eastern Carpathians, which I'll mention more briefly, were discovered both in the period before World War I and the decades following it. The early period has parallels with developments in the Tatras, although elements of a Polish-Ukrainian rivalry also emerged in this ethnically heterogeneous territory. This despite cameo appearances by members of the House of Habsburg. The dynamics of the discovery changed during the Second Polish Republic. Those at its helm found it imperative to shore up the frontiers of this new, fragile, ethnically heterogeneous state. So chapters 7 and 8 explore the proclaimed discovery of the Hutsul region, avowedly just like Chałobinski discovered Zakopane during the 1930s. Well, there certainly were differences. And this is where the Central Military Archive came in handy. Last but not least, part 3 takes up the story of the Bistada Mountains after World War II. With the Hutsul region and the rest of the Eastern Carpathians now under Soviet rule, the Western Bistada Mountains became the southeastern corner of the new Polish People's Republic. After the war, which saw the extermination of the region's Jews, and the emptying out of the region of its Boykos and Lemkos in population transfers and Operation Vistula, the Bistada reverted back to a wilderness. It became the country's wild east, or perhaps its wild west. Here, the battle for the soul of the Bistada concerned its very nature. Was the region to be the Polish wilderness, a trekker's or vacationer's paradise, or yet another industrialized cog in the state socialist wheel? As readers of my book will see, in each of the mountain ranges, with each discovery, the mountains would come to serve as a realm of experimentation as well as encounter, a place far from the lowlands, but where one could work out answers to the burning questions of the day. So much for the briefest of introductions to the Carpathian Mountains through mountain ranges west, east, and center. I've hinted at some of the challenges as well as the promise that the mountains represented. Since the discoveries, Poles and Ukrainians have continued to be fascinated by mountains and/or mountain people. Anyone who has tried to climb the Gievont, or for that matter, most any peak in the Tatras in the summer knows how crowded they can get. But I would argue that the history of the discovery of the Carpathians has also inspired generations of Poles to mountain climbing greatness in the Himalayas. Not knowing anything of this earlier history, one might wonder why the Pole Jerzy Kukuczka was the second person after the Tyrolean Reinhard Messner to attain the so-called Himalayan Crown. That is the successful summiting of the 14 highest Himalayan peaks, each over 8,000 meters high. Yet another Pole, Krzysztof Wilicki, rounded out the top 5. So there are 2 Poles in the top 5 with that distinction. As recently as this fall, the Polish mountaineer Anna Tibor was the first woman to climb to the top of Mount Manaslu, the world's 6th highest peak, without oxygen, and then successfully ski down the mountain. As to Ukrainians, about whom I've said much too little today, the fascination dating from the 19th century seems to lie more with the Hutsuls rather than the mountains, despite the fact that many Ukrainians dutifully and enthusiastically climbed the Hoverla, Ukraine's highest mountain, on Ukraine's Independence Day. Followers of the Eurovision Song Contest may remember how the Ukrainian singer Ruslana won back in 2004 with her Hutsul-inspired wild dances. Even today, other Ukrainian musicians take inspiration from Hutsul culture, blending it into a hybrid yet avowedly Ukrainian culture. Now, none of this may have come to pass had the Carpathians, via the 3 discoveries enumerated in my book, not entered into Polish and Ukrainian culture all those years ago. So I thank you for your attention, and I look forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much. This is fascinating, Patrice. Really fascinating book. And also, I love the way you write. It's so clear, detailed, clear, non-jargony, but very, very insightful. And so I want to ask you a few questions that are related to some of the key arguments, and I think the key literatures that your book really contributes to. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about what you see the relationship between discovery, colonialism, and nationalism, because you show actually that it's a moment of nation building, that this is part of, am I muted? I'm sorry, I'm seeing Gosha is telling
No,
me.
you're fine.
I'm fine, okay.
I certainly hear you.
Okay, good, okay. So that it becomes basically like in other nations at the time, or sometimes slightly earlier, where you, as you mentioned, you basically colonize the borders and you nationalize the people. So there's really a colonial project, and the discourse of discovery is very interesting. And it's a project also of nationalization around different ethnic groups. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about the relationship between these different projects, and then also perhaps reflect on where you see your book fitting in this new intellectual movement in history, sociology, anthropology, in the social sciences and the humanity, to decolonize history, to decolonize museums, for example. So as the history of the Carpathians was also created as a colonial enterprise, how do you deal with that issue in the book? I think people would be really interested in learning more about that.
Wow, that's quite a question. And of course, it's very important, the relationship between this discourse of discovery, colonialism, and nationalism. I mean, what I try to do in the book is to tease out what my protagonists mean by declaring discovery in each of these moments. But as far as colonialism is concerned, now I do raise this in my introduction in a comparison with work such as Yuri Sloskin's Arctic Mirrors and Larry Wolf's Venice and the Slavs. Now, I still see this being a sort of a different kind of phenomenon than an outright colonial discovery. I mean, and here I would also then differ a little bit with the conclusions drawn by Catherine Ciancia in her recent book on Civilization's Edge, which unfortunately came out after I had already submitted my manuscript to the press, so I was not able to engage with it in my own manuscript. I would say that the Poles that I deal with in the book were not engaged necessarily in a civilizing mission, although of course, along with upper class Poles came development into the regions. And of course, when you talk about tourism, Hal Rothman, a historian of the American West who wrote a book called Devil's Bargains, called tourism the most colonial of colonial encounters. So there's no way of getting around some degree of colonialism here. But what I'd like to underscore is that instead of engaging entirely in a civilizing mission, sometimes the opposite was taking place. That is, room was being made for these highland qualities and values within lowland culture. That is, as I mentioned, the lowland populations were to become Highlanderized and not the opposite. So I think there's a bit of a different dimension to all that. But that, of course, is my take on this.
Yes, but yeah, I think it's really interesting, though, how they become also icons of Polishness. So, there's something about how, they become types, iconic of Polishness when actually they are at the edge of Poland.
But it's the edge coming center, the periphery coming center, for sure.
Yes, and I really like how you show this in the book. So that's really interesting. I was also, I really appreciated the fact that you look at a mountain range, and so that your book is not a national history, it's transnational, trans-regional, because even because the mountain range covers different regions of different nations and nations in the making. I think that's very important. So I was wanting to ask you also about what you thought about your book and its place in historiography, and as it relates to other types of new histories. For example, I'm thinking of the oceanic turn, for example, or the focus now on the transatlantic, where you basically refocus around a different object. Here, the mountains, but Pam Ballinger, who's also a member of CREASE, she was trying to also tell the history of the Adriatic. So what do we see by looking in her work at the Adriatic Sea instead of the Balkans, the mountains? So what do you see, especially since your work is comparative? What does your book show that you think does not appear if we were looking even at just like the Tatra Mountains as opposed to the Carpathians that are broader across different ethnic groups and national boundaries?
All right, great. There's a lot of questions in there. I'll see what I can do to answer them.
Pick any. I mean, they're all related.
Let me start the historiographical question. Again, I like to situate my work within various realms of history, that is, within the history of tourism and leisure, within borderlands history, and environmental history, among others. That said, I don't think it fits neatly into any of these categories, although individual chapters or parts may. Where I see my book fitting most neatly tends to be a category that I would call mountains and nation building. Now, this is obviously a narrow category, but it's one that I think Peter Solins began with his book Boundaries, The Making of France and Spain and the Pyrenees. And in more recent times, scholars such as Marco Armiero has written a book called Rugged Nation Mountains in the Making of Modern Italy, or Tate Keller has written Apostles of the Alps, Mountaineering and Nation Building in Germany and Austria. So I see myself as functioning in this kind of an environment. Now, of course, those works are well, it depends on which one you're looking at. Some are more strictly nationally focused, and some have a transnational dimension to them. And I think when it comes to my book, again, you see how each of the discoveries plays out differently. Some have more of that transnational aspect to them than others. For example, the Bistada Mountains does not really have an aspect, because by then the frontiers are closed in a very real sense. The frontiers of the southeastern border of Poland is no longer open to people crossing and hiking in other parts, whereas this was not true either for the earlier periods, the Tatra Mountain periods or the Eastern Carpathian period. Now I've forgotten where I was going with this.
You were talking about transnational, so that's because your book, and you're right that actually certain mountain range within the Carpathians tend to could cross, like Slovakia and Poland, for example, but others are more restricted to one national territory, or what became a national territory at one point. But I think that's what's interesting, is this interaction and the kind of the making of national boundaries through these processes.
Oh, absolutely. This is what is happening in my book, is you're seeing the firming up of the boundaries.
Yes. Yes.
That is, if you look at the Tatra Mountains, I mean, when you look at Haubiński and his traipsing across the mountains, they hiked without regard for the boundaries, which was something they could do because the mountains were the interior border between the Austrian and Hungarian halves of the empire. But what these intelligentsia types in the mountains are doing is they're firming up mentally the border. That is, maybe they're not drawing it on the line, although of course we do have the instance where the part of the border is disputed, the so-called dispute over Morskie Oko, which is a real sense in which Poles wanted to make sure that that prime destination in the Tatras was not taken over by a German who was living in the Hungarian half of Austria-Hungary. Again, this gets a little complicated if you haven't read the book, but the relationships and the identities are all very complex there.
And I think that's what you do so well in the book, is actually telling those stories in a way that they are related to concrete events and peoples, but also to broader macro processes that were occurring at the time in the region, but in Europe more broadly. So, I mean, it's really an impressive piece of scholarship, and a book that will be also used in the classroom for that reason too, because it's accessible. So, you know, it's yes, bravo to you, because it's not easy to write books in such a fashion. I don't want to take too much space here, and we do have now 4 questions. So I will go ahead and start if you're okay with that.
Certainly.
Okay, so one is a very brief question by Len Zabawski, who's a member of Friends of Polish Art in Detroit, and author an article on Carpathian bandits that he published some 30 years ago. So, Mr. Zabawski, nice to meet you here. He's thanking you for the lecture, and he's asking you if you could please repeat the name and region or the group of the bandit outlaw contemporary of Janosik. You mentioned.
You mean the one in the Eastern Carpathians?
Yes.
That's Olexa Dovbush.
Dovbush.
That's how it's given in, sometimes it's translated a little bit differently, but that's how you can find him. And he's, of course, a fascinating figure, a counterpart to Janosik in the Eastern Carpathians.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Then it's really interesting because we have people that are from outside the University of Michigan. So we have a graduate student from Central European University, Yulia Kishchuk, who's thanking you for an amazing talk. And she's saying that she's really interested in the role of photographic medium in the process of imagining indigenous peoples of the Carpathians. And maybe you could recommend some literature on the topic. So that's an interesting question, this issue of photographing the indigenous populations. And perhaps I could extend that question to ask you what use you made of photographic archives.
Well, that's
because the book has beautiful illustrations also.
Thank you. Now I'm going blank on the name of my friend in Canada who has written a lot about the photography that was being done at the time. Let me just think for a second and calm down. Because when I try to think about it, then it goes out of my mind. Ksenia Kiebrzynski, you may know her. In fact, she very recently gave a talk on this subject for the Center of Urban Culture in Lviv. So I'm sure you can even get to that via the internet, because there was a tape made of it. But she's done a lot of work looking at a particular photographer who came into the region about the time when photography was still very, very in its infancy. You know, and it's fascinating to see the types of photographs that were taken. Most of the pictures that seem to be taken of, say, the Hutsuls were looking for types. You know, they're trying to typify, to categorize these people. They're posed rather stiffly, but of course that was also part of the problem of photography in the day. It was very difficult to take your camera equipment out and going around and taking landscape photographs, although those were done also at the time. But I mean, it's a very distinct genre of photography, and that trend actually continues much later in the period, even when you can have people taking pictures more freely. That is, some people were very concerned, for example, that the Hutsuls were always having their pictures taken when they looked authentic, when they were dressed the way they were supposed to be in their Sunday best, not wearing street shoes or having a different sweater on or whatever. They always were looking for authenticity. So you've got that issue that comes to play as well. But photography is a great issue to follow up with in the Carpathian Mountains.
Thank you. Another question by Stephen Naumann, who's associate professor of German at Hillsdale College in Michigan. And he's writing that your first book made a big impression on him in graduate school. He's looking forward to reading this one as well. And his question is about the shifting borders, or the shifted borders in Europe, in particular, the Polish-Ukrainian border after 1945. How did this affect population among these ethnic cultural groups in the Carpathians, and how did it impact Polish and Ukrainian understanding of and relation to the Carpathian regions, plural?
Wonderful. Well, thank you for the compliment and also for the question. Again, well, the shifting borders had a huge impact on what was going on in the region. For those who are less familiar with the borders, again, once upon a time, the border of Poland in the interwar period extended into that Hutsul region, and the entire Eastern Carpathians were cut off when Stalin essentially annexed these territories to the Soviet Union. So you have, at that time, the end of the Polish experiment in the Eastern Carpathians, an experiment in which they were trying very hard to make the Hutsuls into loyal citizens of the Second Polish Republic and sort of leave them in an ambiguous position vis-a-vis both Polish and Ukrainian nations. Now, when you close off the border, the Ukrainians come to the fore. That is, in their claims to the Hutsuls are there, and they're no longer denied because the border tells us that they must be Ukrainians. This meant that for Poles, they had to shift their focus away from that lost territory and those lost populations to the new southeastern border of the Polish People's Republic, which were the Bistada Mountains. And there, of course, it's quite fascinating to see how differently the population was treated than in the interwar period. Because of course, I've mentioned that there are Lemkos and Boykos in these mountains. But the Polish People's Republic was supposed to be a real nation state, not a multi-ethnic state, well, although supposedly also a nation state in the interwar period. So you have this situation where the Boykos and Lemkos, instead of being treated as potential Poles, are expelled from these territories. Either they're sent into the Soviet Union as Ukrainians, whether or not they ever identified as Ukrainians, or they're dispersed within the north and west of the country in the recovered territories. So as to dilute the population and not let them have, so that they would lose their identity. So indeed, the shifted borders after 1945 had a tremendous effect on the region.
So actually, you answered a question that Zbigniew Pasek, who is a UM alum, Ann Arbor resident and member of the Polish community here, and he describes himself here as a Bieszczady wanderer. So he was asking you actually to comment on the fate of the Lemkos and Boykos in post-World War II, and some that were forcibly moved to Lower Silesia in the recovered territory in Wrocław. Yes. But then he's asking if you could speak about their cultural influence on Polishness, but also the work that they accomplished to maintain their original heritage.
So you mean the Lemkos?
The Lemkos.
Yeah. Well, the cultural influence on Polishness, I think, is probably not too profound. Although in the region, what I found very interesting when doing the research for my book is that the discoverers, the young discoverers of the mountains, were fascinated by Boyko and Lemko culture, particularly by the material culture, by what was left in the terrain that they were discovering. That is, you have these beautiful wooden churches, the occasional a cottage still, although the regime was doing what it could to get rid of many of those too, unfortunately. So, I think that what they were hoping to do was what Stanisław Witkiewicz had done in the Tatra Mountains, that it was to create a new hybrid culture out of this relationship. But in communist times, that was much more difficult to do. But I would say, well, again, if you look at the Lemkos in Poland today, some of them identify as being Lemkos still, but others have switched their identity to being Ukrainian.
Right.
So this is something they did not necessarily feel before the war, but it was a label placed upon them when the population was being moved, and a number of them have chosen to identify that way. So you've got this interesting phenomenon going on there as well.
I'll give a plug to a former Kris and Copernicus speaker, Agnieszka Pasieka, who wrote an ethnography of the Lemkos, so that was her doctoral dissertation. It's published by Palgrave. Now, of course, the title of the book escapes me, but wonderful book of ethnographic work in a Lemko village. So for Mr. Pasek. We have two brief questions that we can ask, but before I do, I'd like to talk to ask you a little bit about your Australian sources and what role, that was kind of surprising, and what role they play in the story you tell.
Oh yes, well this was the great find for me, something I never anticipated I would be able to get my hands on. As you know, I'm a historian who usually deals with dead people. And in this book, I deal with some people who are still very much alive. And I was able to locate one of my protagonists via the internet. Janusz Rygielski lives in Australia, and he moved, very importantly, in the early 1980s to Australia. So his memories of Poland are precisely the memories that I wanted him to be able to share with me. They're not covered with layers of other memories since. I don't think he's traveled much since to Poland, although I'm sure he's been there several times, but his memory of the country dates precisely from that period that I was writing about. Now, not only is this his memory, he was a prolific writer. And what Janusz Rygielski did with me was to send me scan by scan pieces of his own home archive of things he had published during this period, and other things as well. So it was just the most wonderful find for me. And it allowed me to finish the third part of my book, because I was still looking for some more sources. And so both he pointed me to some new sources as well as provided his sources. So again, it was a great movement into more modern times for this historian of usually earlier periods.
Oh, that's wonderful. Another question that might be interesting for everyone in the audience, and is about language, and that the Gurale in the Tatras still speak po-Guralsku. They have maintained the language, although less so than it was in the past. I was wondering if you could say a few words about this. The question is by Paul Waczyński. When was the Polish language first made predominant in the Tatras? I remember that Ruthenians also came from that general area, but never became an independent country. So why is it that Gurale and perhaps not other Highlanders maintain a linguistic identity, for example?
Well, I'm guessing, and I don't know this for sure, that part of it was because of the attention that was being paid to their distinctiveness, to their distinct dialect. I mean, one of the things you have in the late 19th century is this fascination with the storytelling that was done by the Gurale, and this was in dialects. You have people like Stanisław Witkiewicz writing down tales of this most famous Gural of all, Sabała. And you have, I think even Sienkiewicz published a tale by him, but Sienkiewicz also importantly turned the Gural dialect into Old Polish dialect in his Teutonic Knights. So, I mean, anyways, you've got all these layers of linguistic complexity going on here. So I think that Gurale in some ways retain this just because it's very much a part of their identity. I think something that is very central to them, and it's something that it's these days the biggest marker in a way, except for the dress that some will wear if they're trying to show you that they are indeed Gurale. But holding on to that dialect, I think is important to many of them, because it is just so much wound up with their, I mean, the vocabulary is related to the mountains. If they're living in the mountains, all of this makes perfect sense to maintain.
But it's interesting that it's not being politicized in a way that, for example, Silesian is, or that the Silesian identity is becoming political. So yeah, it's a very interesting. We're getting toward the end. We don't have any more questions. I don't know. I will leave you the occasion to say the last few words, if you wish.
Well, I guess to sum up, I just thank everyone for coming and posing such great questions. And I hope that you might enjoy my book and find out a little in greater detail what it is that I spent the last 2 decades working on.
Yes, thank you so much, Patrice. And again, this is the book here. We're going to put I see that Małgosia put the link in the chat. If you will get 30% with a code, so I encourage you to buy it. We know that authors and publishers really need our support these days, and I'm thankful for the time you took to meet us on Zoom, and I hope that we can host you in Ann Arbor very soon.
I would love that. I hope so too.
Yes, thank you so much. And everyone, I hope to see you at our next events. If you missed the beginning of the introduction, I will not repeat everything now, but you can go to our website. There are links to all of our forthcoming events. But the next one on Zoom will be on November 17th, a discussion of domestic politics in Poland and the recent EU crisis with Sławek Sierakowski and 2 legal scholars from Poland. Thank you so much, everyone. And until next time, stay safe.